Okay, good morning. Welcome to our learning community. I'm Sally Durstine, and I'm glad you are joining us, whether you're joining in real time or you're tuning in at your leisure. This morning, we're going to be focusing on the board mountain. So far this year, we focused on the shareholder mountain and also the family mountain. But before we delve into this important topic, I am excited to share some really wonderful news. Next month, we will be meeting in person again, along with the option of participating virtually. So this is the best of both worlds. We have all greatly missed these deeper connections of sitting around the tables like we've been doing for the past 30 years, enjoying a meal together, sharing encouragement and counsel. So I think this is just going to be a real homecoming when we come together next month. So stay tuned. Karen will be emailing updated information about our June 22 event, which will focus on the Blue Mountain. We'll be at Berkshire Country Club in Reading, and we'll expand the time, probably 8:30 to 11:30. Well, I am really grateful for each one of you and also for our sponsors who have really shown up over the last 15 months in contributing through the pandemic as well as on family business issues. And they are also very committed to us, our sponsors, and to our mission, which is helping business families to flourish as families, as individuals, and as enterprises. So today's topic on the board mountain, balancing accountability between shareholders and mountains. You will note the board sits in between the management and the shareholder mountains, kind of a balance point. We'll be talking about that a little bit later. But these mountains depict the teams and the structures, what it takes to flourish over the generations. Really provides a good framework for governance, great governance. And because accountability is such an important trait for thriving through the generations, that is our theme this year, accountability. So really accountability and mutual accountability in family businesses, because we're accountable across the mountains. And we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. So I am, just want to share a few logistics. While we're not meeting face-to-face, we are a learning community. So we invite your questions, and you'll see there's a button probably at the bottom of your screen that you can click at any point, the Q&A button, and you can click and type in your questions. We will have time at the end for questions, but if you have questions as we move along, feel free to type them in there as well. And if you have any issues, give Brenda a call at our office, or you can email her at brenda@dvfbc.com. So I am delighted that Julia and Dave, that you both accepted my invitation to share about your experience and wisdom on boards. You are both great human beings. And I like to also say you both really exemplify the traits of humble, hungry, and smart. And our members are well aware of these terms because this is our theme book is The Ideal Team Player. And that's from Patrick Lencioni. And you exemplify those traits, which are good for leaders, board directors, and really all of us. So I'd like to start, Julia, with you. Welcome.
Good morning. How are you today?
Very good. And you look wonderful sitting there on your outside screened-in porch. So could you begin? We'd like to understand a little bit of your background and just, who you are. So talk a little bit about yourself and then kind of your coming into your family business.
Sure. I'm delighted to be with all of you today. I was going to start by saying that I feel like I've climbed all of those mountains. And then I thought really what I've done is I've climbed them, I've slid down them, I've fallen off them, I've climbed them again. So it's a really terrific metaphor. I'm the chairwoman and CEO of C.H. Briggs Company. I wear a lot of different hats, in the family business world. And I feel like I've been kind of hanging around on the periphery of the Delaware Valley Family Business Center from the very beginning, when it was just an idea that Henry had many, many years ago. I've been doing this thing for a long time. I serve different roles. I'm a board director. I'm CEO and chairwoman of our company, CH Briggs. And I serve as an independent director for two other family businesses. And I serve on the board of the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, and my undergrad alma mater, the College of Worcester in Ohio. And I say all that because governance is a theme that runs across all of those roles and is really important to me and has been critical in my development and the development of our company. So CH Briggs has our world headquarters in Reading, Pennsylvania. We're distributors of specialty interior building products. We serve the entire East Coast from Albany to Atlanta. And I'm a third generation owner. My grandparents started the company. It's one of those great all-American stories, started in their garage when my grandfather got out of the Navy. And subsequently, my father, their son-in-law, grew the business as a really kind of stereotypical 70s entrepreneur, cowboy, kind of shoot from the hip kind of guy. And I came into the business after a start running political campaigns. It's a terrific start. And I always thought and got the message that I was destined for much bigger and better things than my family business. But I gave it a try because of my interest in actually in economic development and job creation. And I loved it from the minute I started way back in 1989, which is a very long time ago. So I'm at probably a different stage in my career in the family business than many of the people listening today. I would say I bring a bit of a different perspective. We're more of a business family than a family business. It's an important distinction. I'm the sole shareholder, and our fourth generation, who might be a fourth generation shareholder, but will not have an operating role. I don't know that we'll have an operating company, but he's I was going to say a young adult. He's now actually an adult. And he has an interesting career in global diplomacy and is not going to be in Reading selling building supplies. And we've known that for a long time. So we've created a different plan and a different strategy, including a professional management team with a great president who runs the operations of the company. And I play the chair role and wear that hat more often than any others. Companies like ours, for Dave and I, and for everybody in the audience today, are really the backbone of the American economy, and we're the backbone of our communities. And regardless of what your family looks like or what business that you're in, we have a lot more in common than we do that separates us. And the metaphor of the mountains is the perfect way, I think, to tie together all the different roles that we play. And it'll be great today to talk about that, the board role and the board mountain, because it really does, I think, pull together all of the challenges that our families and businesses face.
Thank you, Julia, for that intro. And also, Dave, could you do the same for us? A little bit about yourself and coming into your business as a first round draft pick, by the way. You know what that means? Married in, so talk to us.
Yeah, no, I understand. Well, you better check with the boss on that one. She tells me I'm still on probation after 43 years, so we'll. So my claim to fame is I'm friends of Julia, have been for many years. First of all, thank you for the invitation and thank you for the work that you guys do. I've had the opportunity to work with both of you in a number of family businesses in a board capacity, and your advice and wisdom and persistence is much appreciated by both me and all those companies. So let me first start off with that, with a thank you. My introduction to the family business, well, first of all, I'm currently the executive director of Episcopal Community Services. When I left Modern, which is the family business I'm associated with, I got called to run a nonprofit in Philadelphia, and that's my particular passion. at the moment. I serve as the chairman of the Modern Group. I am either a board chair or an outside director of a number of other family businesses, Huber, Crazy Aaron's Putty World, Beerus, and Del Val Floral Group. And I also serve as chairman of the Academy of Natural Sciences, which puts me on the board of the Drexel University. And I have the honor, at John's request, to serve on the executive committee and a variety of other committees there. So my journey to Modern came because I married up, and my father-in-law back in the early 80s asked me to come on the board, which he had as an advisory board. My career started with the IBM Corporation. I was there for 18 years. Moved all over the country, had a variety of roles. When I left there, I was an SVP of marketing. At the time I went on the board of Modern, I was running marketing for MCI. And MCI had a significant change of control. And my father-in-law and I had been talking. He had some life events that he needed to raise cash for. And so he and I sat down, and I went from being a board member to coming into running one of the divisions. And Jackie and I, after moving 18 times, said, it's time to settle down, raise our kids. And we were thrilled to be able to put down roots in the community and go to work. Modern is a industrial holding company. When I came, we were roughly a $60 million business. Variety of different businesses, material handling, construction equipment, rental equipment, and over the watch, we've added standby power, which is really the lifeblood of the company as we've gone through transformation. We're the master dealer for Generac. And I came onto the board, as I said, in the early 80s. I joined in early 90s. Went through a couple of different jobs there because my father-in-law just thought it'd be a good idea to know a little bit more than I thought I knew, and he was pretty wise in that. We had a board, and over the subsequent years, we grew the company to a pretty good size. And in 2003, we had a strategy. We were an ESOP. We were also one of Vanguard's earliest 401ks, but we sold it to the employees in 2003. And what was a transition to basically monetize for the family, but also keep it in the family, which is how we've always viewed our employees. And we ran that into 07, 08 when we hit the recession. And that was probably the toughest 4 years I've ever experienced. We got through that. And then in 2013, it was clear it was time for me to make room for the young man that I brought on board to be my successor. The board was all key to that. The fun part of that is even after we created the ESOP and stepped away, the shareholders asked me to stay on as chairman, which I still am today. And we go through. I teach governance. I teach leadership. I think some of you, I've had the honor of presenting to your group in person. I vote to go back in person as soon as we can. The coffee and the Danish are a lot better when we come to your place, Sally, than they are here in my house. So it's the issues of board and governance and accountability is something that's really near and dear, and I think it's really fundamental. I look at the work that we've done over the years, and it can make a huge impact if that governance and that accountability and that outside perspective is done in a thoughtful and dare I say generous way. So I look forward to kind of sharing those thoughts.
Thank you, Dave and Julia. And I also invited Henry to join us for this conversation, given his deep experience in developing and serving on family business boards. For those of you who are new, Henry's our founder. And I think, Henry, you're going to begin with some words about accountability.
Yeah, this is an interesting topic. Most entrepreneurs, I think, start their own businesses because they don't want to be accountable to anyone. And they're ambivalent. I think they're curious about learning, but accountability, maybe there's some apology there for that. So this little screenshot here talks about various levels of accountability that business owners might cycle through. Business owners might meet with a CEO group or an industry best practice group. I think that's really very, very important for presidents and CEOs as they lead their companies. Secondly, then an elected group of insiders, maybe other family members, shareholders, maybe even other managers. But then there's a kind of threshold of increased accountability when we bring in outside directors. Often that begins with one or two, and eventually it might move to all, or maybe there's a 3.5, which is actually probably the most popular, where there's a number of family owners as well as a majority of outside directors working together. So I've had a lot of experience with boards, primarily with nonprofit boards early on, and I think that's where many of us learn, have our first experience on boardsmanship. There are few courses, there are maybe some seminars on how to be a good board member, but most of us learn by trial and error. And so I'm delighted to be a part of this discussion today, and look forward to also questions from those of you who are participating today, because we want this to be as interactive as possible. And by the way, we're not all going to agree. There's lots of good ways to make chicken vegetable soup, and good boards are shaped to fit the particular environment that the business is in. So there's not one right way to do it. We have two very experienced people here who can bring their perspectives, and we want them to be interacting with you.
So I'll kick us off with a question. Dave and Julia, Henry just talked about that threshold, from going from like inside family members to outside directors. So could you each just comment a little bit about when your family business climbed up and over that outside director threshold, and maybe a little bit about why and how? Julia, you want to take that first?
Well, sure. We have not. We've not climbed over that threshold, and I look at that slide with kind of levels 1, 2, 3, and 4, and for me, all the interesting stuff has happened in between those levels. So at CH Briggs, we have an elected outside advisory board. So they don't have fiduciary responsibility, but they are not insiders. They serve at the pleasure of the shareholders, me, and they're elected for kind of a specific skill set or perspective. And that group has really changed over time as our business needs have changed. I serve on, I'm thinking one board in particular, just a fabulous family business that's probably at level 3.5, which is elected with fiduciary responsibility, but with a balance between outside independent directors and family members as they transition from one generation to the next. And it's very formal and very collegial. So an in-between stage that works great for that family and that business at the stage that it's in. If I think about my experience at Briggs, kind of moving up that ladder, if I had lots of or any other family shareholders, I would move to formalize the board for sure. Since there's just a sole shareholder, it's a lot easier to make decisions. I just look in the mirror and, often that's pretty clear. Not always, but often. But having independent eyes on the business and independent eyes that help hold the management team accountable has been a key factor in our growth and success and helping us get through some difficult times.
Dave?
Yeah, we're kind of on the other end of the spectrum. When I joined the Modern board, I was with IBM at the time, and we were already about 30% ESOP. And my father-in-law was pretty clear that getting outside advice and fiduciary oversight and the optics of that to the employees was really important. So we were an early adopter of a fiduciary board. And again, we had a philosophy as a business that we would share fair amount of the retained earnings went to the employees, and so oversight of that was pretty critical. The transition, though, we've had a number of different people on the board and continue today based on domain experience and really the ability to, whether it's logistics, whether it's technology, whether it's Jim Steicher sits on our board and has for years since we did the ESOP. That happens to be his business. He was the advisor who brought us through and we got all done. Jim accuses me that it was cheaper to bring him on the board than it was to pay his fees, but he just has been a bedrock because the ESOP lens is one that, you need a lot of experience to really understand that. We brought on Sally Stetson from Salveson Stetson, the recruiting firm. Sally has just great optics on the HR issues, on the recruiting, on the diversity, and just really the mentoring side. And we found that was a tool that was really critical. We've had people with financial experience, but we always, in that case, it remains critical that the outside and the inside and the fiduciary oversight and as an ESOP, that optics plays. Now, in the other boards I've played, I've gone from being an advisory board that takes a family business from an all family shareholder board into a advisory board into a fiduciary board. I typically get brought into a situation where there is tension in the system, and they're in that level 2 to level 3, don't necessarily know it. And we work through the buffering of the family and potentially bringing in outside CEO because it's at that transition point. One of the great values that the board can serve is as that buffer and that advice giver, and the fact that you're not family gives you the latitude to speak truth in a way without necessarily, you got to care about feelings, but not that much. So it's just one of those issues. As I was talking to you guys before, I think the great value of an outside director is that you don't have to have Sunday dinner. So it's one of those where if you get that mix right, it should lead to better results. It should lead to a lens on decisions. And if you're trying to make money and take care of your employees, the better the advice, the better the strategy, the better you should do. Doesn't always work out that way because stuff happens like pandemics and recessions and those sort of things. I like to think it improves the odds.
Well, I'd like you to address this fiduciary versus advisory situation. You both have probably served in both settings. Are board members less committed if they are on advisory, Julia, than fiduciary? The new
Are
thing-
board member, are board members less what?
Less committed? I mean, is there, what's the dynamic that goes on within the person of the director?
Hmm.
In either case?
Yeah, I don't know that I would judge it on a scale of
Yeah.
commitment, really. Both on the CH Briggs Advisory Board and in the different roles where I've served, people are all in. Their role is just different and their legal responsibilities are different. When I think about what I get hired for, I get hired, whether it's for a fiduciary board or an advisory board, to bring outside perspective and to be a bridge to the next generation, often in mentoring a developing CEO, and as a catalyst for change. And when that, and those are the kind of skills that I bring, and when that matches up to what a company needs, I'm all in to help. And I find that to be true for the folks who've helped us at Briggs, who currently do and have in the past, and in the roles I play. I think that's a question of fit and really understanding the dynamics and the situation that you're walking into. I don't think it's just because something's an advisory board doesn't mean that it's casual. It can mean that, but that has more to do with, I think, the family, the business, and the dynamic, not the legal form that it's taking. I don't know, Dave, has that been your experience? I mean, you've served on a real range of different companies.
Yeah, I would say, look, if you do the right job of recruiting, the level of commitment should be equal to. The issue is a fiduciary board has a level of interaction with the company that may be a better fit than an advisory. And the issue of and the question that just popped up, let me try and work an answer into that, Sally, just saying
Yes,
it.
please.
Advisory is you can give advice to management and to the shareholders, and but not be held liable if there is a lawsuit or there's disagreement. That's the big difference. Where when you go into a fiduciary role, your advice and your decisions, you are responsible for the hiring, firing of the CEO. You are responsible for the outside auditors and to review the audit and to make sure that it is legit and solid and all those good things. You are also responsible from an accountability point of view to certain outside vendors like the bank. And you have a level of accountability that is more intense. It's the reason I like directors and officers insurance for both sides, but it's absolutely mandatory on the fiduciary side. But your role then is who has the authority to make decisions. So you represent the shareholders. You are the buffer between the shareholders and management. Often shareholders are on a family board. I like to see the mix where there's more outside directors than inside. I'd like to see an odd number of directors so that tie breaks or don't become an issue. In all the years I've doing it, I've never had to go to a tiebreaker, which kind of is indicative of the power of consensus and then decision making. But the fiduciary piece is you are at a level of accountability to the shareholders, and I would argue there's really 6 major stakeholders. We can get into that in a later question. It's not just shareholders you're accountable to, but really the other universe there. That'd be family, employees, customers, suppliers, community, and shareholders. And that's a different way of thinking about the board's role and senior management's role. But in my experience, when you think about all those stakeholders, it tends to drive better results.
And just to be crystal clear, when Dave says a fiduciary board is responsible for and accountable for, he means legally.
Yeah.
Right, legally.
Yep.
Good clarification.
Yeah, so if there is a shareholder lawsuit, you're a fiduciary board, you're in the crosshairs. And you see that with public companies, all the time. But there's a level of, there can be good reasons to do that, because if you are a fiduciary board, and let's say the dynamics with the family shareholders maybe is not all kumbaya, the ability to have outside directors be the buffer and have the ability to take steam out of the system, to translate, to help drive strategy, and also, frankly, retain a really good CEO if you've gone for an outside CEO. Let me tell you, that to me is where I've spent a lot of time, is that buffering. And frankly, you want to have decision-making authority if you're in that, because sometimes that's the hammer you got to use. Now, you're held to a vastly higher standard, in my opinion, as a fiduciary than as an advisory, because fiduciary, the CEO is obligated to listen to the board. In an advisory deal, it's an advisory role. They're not obligated. So in other words, if, spending authority, if the board says, no, you can't spend it, in a advisory role, the CEO can go do that. In a fiduciary board, we go to at least the next round or two, just in a very practical sense. So
I like to go back to Julie. You said some of the, what you bring in particular, as well as an outside director. You talked about outside perspective, developing the next generation, a catalyst for change, particularly with this one that you're working on. Could you both comment a little more on, the unique value of outside directors? Anything else you would add to that? Because that's a big leap, like it's the why. So other things that outside directors uniquely bring.
Well, I think often there's a need for domain expertise. Somebody who really understands the industry at a very sophisticated level, or particular functional expertise in an area where a company is either has some remedial needs or is trying to get ahead, or as industries change, really trying to kind of keep up. I think too, there's sometimes a thought that you can supplement the management team with an outside view, outside expertise. Dave mentioned kind of being a buffer between generations. I would say that's something that I probably would never get hired for. That requires kind of a level of therapeutic skill and empathy that I just don't have. Dave's way better at that than me. So I think those specific needs are very unique to particular companies at particular times, and that also changes over time.
Yeah, I go back to what Henry said, is every board, and what Sally said is every board really needs to be matched to a particular company at a particular moment in time. There's a reason there's term limits on a board, because you may be perfect at point A, but not so much at point B. Mm-hmm. And it really, Julia, you're absolutely right. There's times when a board needs to be the buffer, and I remember calling Henry once and saying, "Hey, Henry, you forgot to mention the following," and he kind of smiles and laughs and says, "Well, that's why you're there," and off you go. But it's look, it's an honor to serve on a family board. Think about it. People are asking you into their lives, to the thing that dominates their family discussions. And I hope that if we do a good job, the family business no longer dominates the family discussion. There's a better balance. But it's, you're asked to try and help them solve, a given issue. And then other issues become, and then, pandemics hit and recessions hit, or a new competitor comes in, or, a key employee leaves, or, there's lawsuits, there's, a vendor pulls a product line. I mean, all these are things that if you are a savvy business leader, you'd like to have the ability to have a safe conversation with people who care about you, care, but and have a different level of accountability to the deal. If a board is running right, it should be the safest place to have the tough discussions. And that should be the goal. And you got to come into the room as a grown-up. And you got to say, look, it's okay for the CEO or a shareholder to say, look, I'm really struggling with X, Y, or Z. The strategy, is the other piece. Is there a strategy? I'm a big mission, vision, values guy. If you get those right, then all the strategy should go through that lens. And your job is to remind people, guys, we have a mission, we have a vision, we have values. And does this decision, and we have stakeholders, and how does this ripple through? And you would think that the shareholders and senior management would want to be able to safely say, well, I have idea A, I have idea B, and I have idea C. What do you think are the pros and cons of that? And it's not to tell them what to do. Our job really, of really good board members, is to ask the really hard questions. And dare I say, the uncomfortable questions. A lot of times when I see a family business get in trouble is nobody wants to name the elephant. And if we name the elephants, generally we can deal with them. So it becomes that's kind of the real, and fiduciary just is in my opinion a more powerful tool, in that the board then has the ability to say yes or no in a way that raises the need for, the shareholders can always fire you, but generally in my experience, most of the shareholders are rarely 100% in alignment. And so that buffer is really, really critical.
What's unique in the family business world, I think, as compared to the public company world, is you can bring in outside perspective, but from people who genuinely care about you, care about your family, care about the employees and the success of the business. That's not something that happens in the public company world, where we hear stories about activists and investors who blow up companies. It's just on a very different level, but you can bring in that outside perspective, the really hard questions. For me, it's always been most successful when it's in an environment of caring and the success of the family and the business together. That's what makes this whole world that we're all in so unique and special.
Yeah, and the corollary to that, Julie, great reminder, is to really force a family to say, what is it that you want? Because I'm amazed that, not amazed, we had the same issues at Modern, but what is it that the family and each individual shareholders, what is it that you want? And then does the mission, vision, values, and the strategy align with that goal, right? Some families want to harvest, some families want to grow, some families want to hand it down to the next generation, some families want to clean it up to sell. someone who, merge and grow, do acquisitions. I mean, those were all issues, but that alignment is really where the board can really say, well, wait a minute, guys, are we being opportunistic, or does this fit the strategy? Or, have you thought about, the reality of I'm a big believer that the board has a duty to be kind of the radar along with the CEO. What's coming at us? Can we get out ahead of the day-to-day and think about what's coming? One of the boards I serve on is Huber out in the central part of the strait. Great family business. I think Chuck's probably on the call. But one of the questions I think we're really good at taking a look at is, let's look at what is the technology that's coming in the farm space. This whole thing about, tractors that, drive themselves and understand, the technology. I mean, it's no longer fix an engine. I mean, you're fixing a computer on wheels that happens to do a function. What's that mean for technicians? What does that mean for, inventory? What does that mean for where we're going, and do we want to, have all our eggs in one basket and one brand and one product line? And those kinds of discussions require capital if you execute on them. And guys, are you prepared? Do you understand the consequences of long-term, capital stacks? So those are things that if you've gone through it 3 or 4 times, you generally have pretty good scar tissue. And I think a lot of the board's job is to share that scar tissue and say, hey, have you thought about X, Y, or Z? And then kind of work through. And then that alignment internally, I think, is really where and look, you can say that again, as a non-family member, you're not being judgmental that somebody hasn't thought of it. You're saying it because you're asking a question that has a legitimate business perspective and background. I also think 90% of my really good board work gets done, and I know Julie believes this, is just to be present and listen. I can't tell you the number of times I've had a CEO vent, but by the end of the deal, they've answered their own question, come up with their own solution, and you go, okay, I've drank my 2 Diet Cokes. It was really good being with you. I'm glad you got it. But being just a thoughtful, passionate listener, which is not something I do genetically very well, but it's really, 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 I think, as I've learned over the years, sometimes you just got to be present. They got to trust, and they just want to have somebody that they can talk to. And that counts for shareholders too. Who say, look, I'm really frustrated.
Sorry.
No, go ahead,
Another way
Jill.
to describe that is as a thought partner. A good board member is a thought partner to the CEO, to shareholders, that kind of sounding board, somebody who's all in to help. That's why your board's there, to help. That's invaluable.
Love that. And that reminds me of, Dave, I think it was you a few years ago when you presented and you talked about one of the main purposes as well, I think maybe of the chair, of really nurturing the president. You want to comment, both of you, a little bit on the chair's role? Like, how is that different? And you're both, so Dave, you want to take that first?
Yeah. Nurturing may not be the image, but the tough love may be the way I might better describe it. But look, the chair's role and the CEO's role, if it's working right, should be a partnership. It should be collaborative. It should be, I love Julie's word of thought partner. Great way to describe it. But it's also to ask the really tough questions. And it's not to be the CEO. It's not to be the manager. It is not the board's role to run the company. It is the board's role to coach. And the way I find coaching most effective is to ask that, have you thought of, or what about, and, have we looked out 2 years, and what is this vendor telling us, or, whatever the deals are. It's also to introduce resources into the equation that you might have experience with. And look, I also think, and we talked about this over the years, sometimes when it goes absolutely dark, it's good to have people in the room who know where light switches are. It's just, if you're a new CEO and you've never been through a recession, well, look, guess what, guys? The sun comes up. It doesn't feel like it, but here's some steps that if you do, the odds go up. And by the way, the recession is not your fault. Your job is to manage through the recession, right? And to work your way through. Same time in the boom times. When we're rocking and rolling and boom, let's be a little humble here and put some money in the bank and think about, level and steady generally wins. And also to have courage. There's some tough decisions. Have the courage to make those tough decisions. And the biggest role that I have found is to give people the confidence to make a tough personnel change, particularly in a family business. And that is, that in my experience, that's been the really tough, crucial conversations to have. Julie, I know you spend a lot of time in this space. What do you think?
I really agree with you. You've laid out a lot of important roles. I would add one more from kind of the management team, president, CEO perspective. The board can be board chair, or the board as a whole can be not an excuse, but you can point to a board to say, like, I couldn't possibly remember, we've got board eyes on us, or, the board has really suggested this, and that's not a substitute for courage. That's not abdicating, but it's bringing some extra, you're marshaling some extra resources as a management leader when you've got to make a difficult decision or bring in a new perspective. Sometimes it helps to point over there. I think of this sometimes as a metaphor. I remember when our son was an infant, and that there was, some chicken dinner or something that I didn't want to go to, and I would say, "Oh, yeah, I couldn't possibly participate. I have an infant," which is really good. I wish I could still use that now. But I think sometimes, realistically, the president or a CEO of a business can say, like, "Oh, we can't do that. Remember, we're answering to a board. We're at a higher level. We've got different eyes on us." That perspective really needs to be incorporated, because sometimes, especially when you have a team that's been together for a long time, that has its well-worn groove of how it thinks and how it operates, having that outside perspective break in can really be incredibly useful and a bit disruptive. So I like to look at the board in playing all of those roles.
I'd love to also hear all of your thoughts on, a family chair or an outside chair, either experiences you've had or your thoughts on that.
I think that a lot to do with the size and stage of your business.
Yeah.
And there are probably some folks in the audience today saying that either one of those, well, that would never work. That doesn't make sense for where we are. But the larger you are and the more family members that you have involved, you're dealing with a whole different level of complexity where, sometimes the outside chair is absolutely essential. And other times you need a family chair to make sure that all the different branches of the family are able to come together. I think it's unique to each business. Dave, what's your perspective?
Yeah, I was mentored a lot by Phil Clemens from the Clemens Hatfield Meat folks, and Phil is that that very unusual individual who could build consensus within the families and the wide arms. And I mean, just a lot of respect. But he would readily tell you that we're the exception, not the rule. And so I think, as Julie said, you got to read the leaves. I happen to think an outside board chair makes a lot of sense when there is family shareholders and a non-family CEO. I just think it's a linkage. You're responsible to the shareholders, you're responsible to the other stakeholders, but I often encounter where particularly new CEOs are going, well, what do the shareholders think? And the question is, are you asking for feedback on a management decision, or you want them to be the managers? And your job is to manage the company and go back, and your decision better be good enough that they go, yeah, that's absolutely the right decision to go. All right. Understand the difference in that dynamic. And I think, an outside board chair can fairly represent, without any legacy baggage, all the parties. And a family deal, they may be like the Phils of the world, but in my experience, they were really, really rare breeds. Now, having said that, I'm chair of the modern group. I'm still family. I'm still, even in an ESOP, I'm still the largest shareholder. But it's nowhere near control. Let me be really clear. We're 100% owned by the employees. I happen to be one. The issue is, I've been away now 8 years, 9 years, and we have other outside, John and Sally and a couple other members of the board are outside directors. It really depends on situational, to be honest with you, and just that. Again, this is where I come back to mission, vision, values, and do you buy in? And I really think the job of the board is, what's the strategy? What drives me nuts is when I go to a board meeting and it's reporting of financials, it's reporting of boom, 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 and stuff that you can read. I really think boards should spend 70% of their time on strategy and radar, and 30% on the stuff. Yep, that's the budget. That's, bing, bing, bang. And I do think approving budgets and holding people accountable to budgets and forecasts and the variables, that's all critical. But strategy and the implementation of strategy and the tools that the company's acquiring, building to drive strategy is really where I think a board should spend a lot of its time. And I just think outside, make sure that all the voices are heard. If you're a second generation board chair and you got third generation coming up, and you've seen me in diapers, am I going to challenge it? Right. So it's just.
Yeah. I'd like to, if I could, Sally, just kind of circle back to the slide that Henry put up about the kind of levels of board engagement, because I'm trying to listen to this. If I'm in the audience and I'm just starting to think about governance and what might that look like in our family, in our company, I think I would be shaking in my boots to think about an outside non-family board chair who could fire me tomorrow. So I just want to reiterate that there are stages.
Yep.
Depending on your family and your business, there are a lot of ways to step into better governance and better accountability. And if your first step is, I've joined the Delaware Valley Family Business Center, and I have one of our upcoming leaders in a next generation leader lab, and we're in a consortium over here. Maybe I'm a Vistage member, or maybe I belong to YPO. That's a step, right, in continuing education and outside perspective. And what we're talking about here are other steps. I don't want anyone to be intimidated or turned off by the idea of, you need an outside non-family board leader, or you're not doing it right.
No, it's
Again,
These things evolve.
great.
yeah. And
It's
not
a-
one size fits all.
Right.
Absolutely. And Henry, I'm just curious, do you have your thoughts on this?
Well, I agree completely with Julia. One of the ways that we often propose as the first step is to get the advisors together in one room to discuss the issues that the family is facing. And sometimes we chair that group, often we do, but that helps the family to see, oh, how this might work. Now you got to have really good advisors and to make that work. And we work with a number of companies where they've really renewed their advisors. I remember talking with Julie, wow, how many years ago? 30 years ago, Julie? About the changes that she had to make with her advisors and with her top team. And to have other people, as Dave said, to kind of undergird the confidence to make really difficult legacy personnel decisions is really key. I would like to shift back to the chairman's role here, and particularly the accountability and the evaluation of the president CEO. So how have you seen that done well?
So there's a process, Henry. In my experience, you lay out goals for the fiscal year. You lay out goals for a time period longer than that, 3 to 5. And there's some elements to those goals that have a financial attribute, have a cultural attribute, have a strategic attribute, and that there's certain steps we're going to take to get ready for the next step and the next step. And that, financial performance shouldn't be the only measure for a CEO. The quality of the team, the positioning of the company, the storytelling that's necessary, the customer acquisition, the customer laydown, actually, because there's two sides of that. But in my experience, where it's really done, we're very clear on those goals. We take an opportunity, maybe not every board meeting, but to visit those goals. I'm a big fan with the CEOs that I work with, is sit down and say, hey, it's mid-year, let's take a look. Are we tracking for year end? Do we have course correction? Look, the pandemic threw a huge curve, and a lot of this is a great example. So we reset goals. Who knew what a PPP was, 18 months ago? That became a pretty damn important goal and kind of going through things. So we evaluate against goals. We then have, I'm used to then going to the full board for feedback on how we felt against those goals. We've used outside 360s really, really effectively. And not just the board to evaluate, but also maybe the direct reports. And that feedback has been really, really helpful and useful. And frankly, I'm a big fan of maybe it's a $3,000 or $4,000 expense to get it done right, but to have somebody who does that professionally and objectively and anonymously, it's hard to argue with data, right? And here's the data, and if 11 of the 12 people survey say X, and you have an outlier, let's understand why there's an outlier. It doesn't mean the outlier is wrong. Let me be very clear, but let's understand, and have those discussions. And when I've done it that way, and I think accountability shouldn't be a one-year thing. I think it's how are we doing against goal? How are we going against target? I'm a big proponent of board comp in some way being directly tied to company performance. So that maybe you have a fee, but if the strategy gets executed, the company ought to perform, and you ought to be willing to go the ups and downs. I mean, a number of the boards that I serve on in the pandemic, we all took pay cuts because management took pay cuts. I mean, it's, that alignment and kind of this, and to Julie's comment before, that may not be where you are right now. I mean, there's these different stages of where you go and where you do, but I'm a big, what's the mission, vision, value? What's the strategy to execute it? Okay, let's chunk it into annual goals and 3 to 5 year strategic goals. And let's, what are the metrics that say we're on the journey and have we arrived? And then be really open, very open to tuning those based on outside circumstances. If it would have been really irresponsible last year to measure people on the budget you had approved at the end of 19, right? Still surviving, big accomplishment, right? So, I mean, just, you got to tune them in context, but still hold accountable that, hey, is it an excuse or is it a real variable?
Well, Henry, I think I'd answer that by telling you 2 stories. One's a bad story with a good ending, and the other was a questionable story with a good ending. And the first one is really about me. My advisory board, going back many, many years, so a couple iterations ago in our business, we had the team, presenting to the board. And, I wanted our team to have a little bit more outside exposure. We're very internally focused. I wanted them to kind of see how other people did it. And I wanted our board to give me some feedback on how I thought, how this great team was performing. And I had one person who wanted to be the next CEO of the company, and who I thought was kind of on a good path to do it. And it became very clear over the course of a year working with the board that this person is just not right, not the right fit, not the right skill set, just not right in lots of ways. And that was hard for me to see, but the board saw it right away, and was pretty tough on me in saying, what are you waiting for here? What other evidence do you need? And so that helped accelerate a number of decisions. And this person ultimately self-selected out to go do entrepreneurial things, which was terrific. Had a great ending for them, and a really good ending for the company. But without that evaluative tool from the outside, I'd like to think that I would have gotten there myself quickly enough, but maybe not. So that was tremendously valuable, even though it wasn't a formal 360 review process. That would have gotten me to that decision much more quickly. But the board was able to pick up on it faster. And then secondly, I think a really good story, where I've been hired as a board leader to help a next generation CEO really develop and to build skills and confidence to be able to really lead the company in its next iteration. And that's worked terrifically. And again, with mostly informal tools, lots of conversation, some very direct feedback, but to really be a thought partner, to be a helper, to be a safe, place to have tough conversations. How do I speak with my dad? How do I work with my cousins? I've got this very difficult person over here who's been with the company for 100 years, and you wouldn't believe that they're an obstacle given what their role is, but they're a real obstacle. How do I manage that? And in this situation, the person's become a phenomenal leader. And I think that's been accelerated through working with the board. So, I see a lot of different roles that board members can play in helping the president or CEO develop. It's really up to both sides to make that happen, and not just hope that through osmosis, management leaders can kind of miraculously develop. It never happens like that.
Yeah, I think a board is really the CEO's best friend to help them to kind of see themselves. Because if you're a CEO, you gotta have a lot of confidence, a lot of clarity, and sometimes we don't see our own blind spots. And you can BS a peer group, you can BS a coach. Pretty tough to BS a strong board that has more experience than you do. Family businesses, the problem with family businesses is the family. The strength of the family is the family, right? So to find the right mix here between kind of family unity and family culture and business performance, it's not an easy thing to do. I'd like to shift here to kind of board accountability to the shareholders, especially around continuing service. What are some of the things that you've seen done well or not so well regarding telling the truth to board members, particularly board members who may have fit, but today they don't fit anymore? I mean, I've noticed some of our clients, they have brought on board members maybe really early, but then they keep them for 15 years and they don't rotate them. They don't refresh them. So and it gets to be, the old boys or old girls club, and the board members become part of the family culture rather than outside of it critiquing it.
The simple answer to a very complex question, Henry, is terms and term limits. And it is I'm very much a 3-year term staggered. And if we get beyond 3 terms, then there needs to be, and it's okay to go for 20 years if you're adding value and you match, because that history and that perspective can be really valuable. And it really is thing, but the term limit gives you the opportunity to have that conversation and force that conversation that might be really, really uncomfortable. I have facilitated taking a couple of people off boards as directors where the chemistry might have been good, but it just started to evolve where it just wasn't working. And part of the problem is the board chair. Part of the opportunities board chair is that's your job. It's not the CEO's job. It's not the shareholder's job. Now, if the issue is with the chair, give the shareholders the opportunity to vote you out. And that's where a term limit comes through. And I just think that needs to be a very well-defined process. I bet you where you have that issue, there's not term limits.
Yeah. If you build them in from the beginning,
It's the expectation.
So much easier.
Yeah.
And if you don't have them, then the sooner you put them in, the easier it becomes.
And
I also encourage us to think about it as refreshment, board refreshment, so that it's not always a loaded, difficult, painful conversation.
I'll give you a great, Julie, I'll give you a great example. We're right at Del Val. We had a board meeting yesterday, and one of the items that we talked about from a governance committee point of view was, okay, guys, we're down a director. is it time to replace? And what are the attributes that we want for that director? So I went as the board chair to the shareholders and says, I'd like you and the management team to come back to me and tell me where are the skills that you think we have gaps in as you look at the strategy and as you look at where we want to go as a business. And maybe it's, I'd love somebody who's really deep in logistics. I'd love somebody who really right now, and I think we're going to be in this for a while. The interesting one is we'd really like somebody who understands the labor and the HR labor and union experience and has kind of been through that whole process, you know, multiple times. They're really hard to come by right now, by the way. But they're going to go through and identify the skills that they as management and they as shareholders would like to see. And then we'll come back as a group. We'll prioritize those because there's no one person who does all those. And then we'll start the search, you know, and we'll see where it goes. But it's I think, and again, if you're in that level 3, level 4, you probably ought to have a governance committee. And that's, the person who does, the committee that does the evaluation of the board. I'm a big fan of the board getting evaluated every year by the shareholders formally. What's working, what's not working, and to intentionally ask it that way, because, I'm a big fan of wandering around and saying, how we doing and what can we do better? You do it with customers, you do it with employees, you also ought to do it with your board. How we doing and what could we do better? And that tends to drive, I think, some behavior.
And Henry, just one wise guy comment, if I could. I've never seen a board that's kind of stuck and needs to be refreshed where the problem is that it's an old girls club. Never seen it.
You're right. That was a reach, wasn't it?
So another question has risen up here around compensation. We didn't talk about that. Could we talk about that a little bit? And then Henry, I'd like you to say a few words about, evaluating and recruiting and kind of the shareholders' role in that. So compensation, that always comes up. And I just like to say 30 years ago when we started this, hardly any of our members had outside directors. And now I looked over our demographics, about 40% do, and at least 50% that are participating today do. So we've come a long way, baby, on that one. But could you all talk a little bit about compensation? I know it varies, but your thoughts on compensating board members?
Well, Julie, okay if I go first here on this one? Or?
Sure.
Yeah, I have a couple rules on board comp. One is I never want to bring on a board member who needs the income.
Yeah.
And I say that somewhat tongue in cheek, but I've had the scar tissue of somebody who was reluctant to tell the family to sell because the board would be dissolved, and yet it was in the best interest of the deal. And that's a scar tissue moment. I think you got to compensate, and I have some rough rules, and this is formulistic and it's directionally correct, but not precisely correct. I like to look at the CEO's total comp, divide that by the 2,080 hours, and then and this is for a sanity check, and then take a look at, I think if you're doing the board job right, should be 10 to 15 hours a month of reading, of prep, and meeting. And I'm talking the 4 times a year type cycle. And then I'm a big fan of having a performance element to it. But, and that can be a negotiation where we go. Now, bigger boards, fiduciary responsibility, the amount of time, but kind of as a rough rule of thumb, that's where I look. And larger companies are going to have larger deals. But I've seen small family businesses where the outside directors are 10 grand a year, And I've seen boards where, it's 60 to 70,000 a year. And it's, again, depends on size, complexity. But I really like to chunk that to committees, to board meetings, prep time. But I'm increasingly a big fan that 10, 20, 30% of your comp ought to be directly tied to company performance. And however the management team or the share, I just think it forces you to look at the strategy and look at the performance and make tough decisions on overhead and, all those things. If you're on a board, and it also just puts you into alignment with shareholders and with the board. But again, I really, and I don't know how to evaluate this one. It's just something I feel strongly about is if you're going to go be a board member, it can't be for the income. You got to be called to do it. And the income isn't nice, but you don't want to let that just, and that's a tough situation. I also frankly like to put a COLA so that we're not sitting here. Some of us have been boards for a long time, and whatever they decide for COLA, we do with the board, so that it just becomes a non-issue.
Thank you.
Another rule of thumb on if you're getting started with an advisory board is to take a look at what you pay your highest paid advisor. Your probably your attorney, and kind of juice that up a little bit and use that as a rule of thumb for an hourly rate to get started, assuming some prep time, some meeting time, and some follow-up time, and to build that in by quarter or by the meeting. That's an easy way, I think, to slide into it. And just like David said, as a board member, you don't do this for the comp. The flip side is also true, that you also don't want people who are doing it for free, right? You want to say that this is a real thing that we're really investing in, and we're going to carve out a budget line to buy outside counsel and advice, and we're going to take it seriously. That doesn't have to be $100,000. It can be $2,000 a meeting, but that's another just kind of rule of thumb to figure it out.
Yeah. The other thing, remember, is while the board meetings are, physical markers, you want a board member to be willing to take a call at 8:30 at night,
right,
and spend an hour with you on the phone, because it's those calls that make the huge difference. And that is impossible to schedule. But my point is, a retainer doesn't mean 4 meetings a year. It means you are available when it hits the fan, and you're there for advice, you're there for counsel, you're there for safety net, and sometimes you're just there to listen for an hour and let somebody vetch. I mean, it's just, and I will tell you, my personal experience, those are where you're earning your keep as an outside board member, as an outside chair, and sometimes it's the other board members, quite frankly.
Another thing I've run into a number of times is having board fees donated to charity.
Charity, yeah.
And you always want to be paid at least $1 so that you're covered by D&O insurance. But as I think making that easy, if that's what a board member would like you to do on their behalf, I think is really a nice gesture. And I've been on a board where the company has not made that easy, which is unfortunate, because everybody's situation is different.
Good point. Thank you. Henry, will you share some thoughts with us on, would you like to share some thoughts on?
Yeah. Part of our role as advisors is to walk with the family and look with clear optics, to use Dave's image, at all the mountains. And many of the companies that we work with, they're moving toward professional management, and that's the point at which the accountability of the CEO is really very important, and it's really hard to be accountable to your own family, to your own siblings. So the issue of boards come up a lot. And Sally, if you could put the board mountain work slide up. This gives a little, what does a board charter look like? What are the elements? We've covered almost all of these in our discussion this morning. And that gets wrapped up into a prospectus, which is maybe a 3 or 4 page document, which describes what your board looks like, what you want your board to achieve, what are the goals, and how you're planning to work through it. Now, the important thing that I have a particular interest in and have worked on as chair of several board development committees, or sometimes they're called governance committees, but to make sure that the shareholders are doing their ongoing work of defining what they want the board to be doing. Now, the board has a responsibility in that, and also the CEO can also has a huge interest in that. And I find that sometimes shareholders are kind of the least awake about this kind of responsibility. There's a sense in which they almost delegate their fiduciary responsibility as owners to board members. And it's best when you've got 3 mountains, all of which are tugging toward higher levels of achievement. And so the whole process of bringing on board members, I think they need to, of course, understand what the business is, but they really need to understand who the shareholders are and what are their interests. Ideally, board members will have a very brief, thoughtful shareholder covenant, we call it, mission, vision, values, and any policies or cultural things that are really important to them, which creates the boundaries for the board's work. Now, many times that isn't done well, and if the board doesn't have that from the shareholders, they have no choice but to create their own boundaries. And then the shareholders may have to tell them when they're crossing an unknown boundary. But anyway, the annual board and member evaluation process, I think, is very important. And I think that should be a joint effort between the board and the shareholders. Many times boards, I think, take too much responsibility for that. I think to have that as a joint partnership to really speak the truth about the function of the board and board membership. I like term limits as well. I actually think looking at terms of about 3 years, but being aware that every year you are going to be evaluated, and every year you can be asked to leave the board. So this board development function, I think, is often underserved in nonprofits and business and in other board settings. Sally, if we could go on to the next slide of the shareholder mountain work. You'll notice that the board charter is the center function of the shareholder's job, that they can never give that up. They have to keep the board refreshed. They have to be willing to look at their own functioning and look at who the family members that are on the board. Sometimes it's we'll rotate people. Well, maybe we don't all have the same skills. So we need to think through how we as shareholders are going to tell the truth to each other about who has the competencies that we need in order to really have a strong functioning board. So those are the few of the things that we offer to clients who are looking to cross that outside director threshold, which is very scary to many people, particularly entrepreneurs. In my experience, entrepreneurs really back away from that. Not the best one. I think of Dave Hollinger at Four Seasons Produce, who's an entrepreneur. When he was in his 50s, he brought in a strong board before he was facing succession issues. Many times boards come in during the second generation time. And so any time is a good time to bring on board that's customized to your needs.
Thank you, Henry, for that. By the way, let's see. I think we've answered the questions that have been coming up, which is very good. So I'd like to just ask, we have a few minutes here, any closing comments or encouragement or counsel that you would like to give those listening in now or later? Here's your chance.
Go ahead, Julie.
I'd say to not be afraid of outside help, outside perspective, and the acceleration that can come by expanding your family business circle to include trusted others, whatever form that might take wherever you are. I would run to it rather than run away from it. And I'd encourage you to have a lot of conversation with potential folks. You know, when you see kind of board charter and board development, sometimes I think that sounds like it should come ready-made, you know, from your brain to the paper. But it takes some real work to identify what you need and when and who and what that might look like, and that's a process. So I think I'd encourage you to get into that process by talking with folks who have been there and done that. And I think you'll find more ease, and not just accountability, but ease and acceleration in your business when you get to be able to actually do it.
Thank you, Julia.
Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts, Sally, and again, appreciate the opportunity to participate in this today. Look, accountability tends to drive results or change, which is what all businesses go through, and both are really good, but data is even better. So to be data driven, I think, is a board attribute that we need to build. You know, I love Winston Churchill's quote, even with the best strategy, it's good to occasionally check results. That really sums to me, you know, the board. You know, great strategy, but let's see how we're doing. And by the way, can you prove it to me? Those are powerful things. You know, I mentioned this one, you know, when it gets dark, it's good to have somebody who knows where the light switch is. Experience matters, scar tissue matters. Scar tissue, as you've heard me say, is often the best teacher. So to have people who have experience that, you know, care about you, care about your company, care about your employees, who are willing to share that and hold the lens up. Listening is an incredibly important skill. And one of the things I look for in a really good board member, do they give feedback of what they have heard? In other words, if I have an hour discussion with my CEO and we're talking and he's kind of raised a number of issues, I find it incredibly important as a board to say, well, this is what I think I've heard. And just continue to drill and distill that so that there's clarity. And particularly with shareholders, I find that incredibly important, because we'll have long discussions. And 9 times out of 9 times, when I go through that distillation process, it gets refined. And you got to drill down. And I think a board is really good. And then the thing that you as a board need to be willing to do is throw a flag when you hear BS. That is the hardest thing for a board to do, is just to go, no, sorry, that's great. That's wish, not data. And again, I come back to the board, if it's done right, should be the safest place to put ideas, to be vulnerable, to say I'm struggling with issues. So I just think as I look at those things, and then the other thing that I am reminded with family business is, you know, one of those data points is cash and cash flow. And I know that sounds incredibly, you know, that's not mission, vision, values. It's not necessarily strategy, but that's the data points that I think we got to just constantly check. Because if you pay attention to the basics, the company has the opportunity to thrive and grow and deliver for all the stakeholders. And so that reminding people of basics and keeping coming back to the basics is really important. And the board can play, if it's functioning, highly functioning, it can play in all that. It's hard work. It's hard work, and you gotta be brave, and you gotta have the courage to be willing. If you're a CEO or you're a family business and you're asking outsiders to come in and you're willing to pay people, you need to be willing to listen. And that is often the hardest step. But I got to tell you, most of the companies I see that have had great growth have that partnership. And, you know, so that the data kind of speaks to why we do this. But look, Julie said it best. There's 4 stages. You guys have 4 stages. Don't get intimidated by the complexity. Start simple, as Henry says, climb the mountain, to beat that analogy to death. But climb the mountain, and you got to start at the base and go up.
Sally, I'd also add, I'm always happy to chat with anyone who, you know, just wants to have an off the record conversation to explore any of these issues one-on-one. You know, I've got a lot of scar tissue, you know, Dave's favorite statement. And I'm happy to share my experience for whatever that's worth. If anybody would like to chat, I'm certainly available. I think the world of the work you're all doing and the work that all your families are engaged in. So yeah, reach out if that would be of value to you.
Yeah, and I would echo the same. Just happy to be of service.
Thank you so much. And Henry, any closing thoughts?
Well, I don't know of anyone who regrets moving to outside direction. They may regret it for a day or a week or 2 because of feedback that they don't want. But long term, I think strong boards just are a major part of sustainability over the generations. It's a skill to create a board and to monitor a board and to be on a board. So if you want your company to last for another 100 years, focus on all the mountains because they all need attention. But the board one is the one we probably have the least experience with. The shareholder one, you know, kind of going to one voice is really tough for families to find one voice. And ultimately the boards have to function with one voice as well. So thank you to Dave, Julia. And I think our members are very eager to share their experience, their scar tissue, their successes, their failures in managing boards.
Yes. Yes. Thank you, Julia, Dave, and Henry for joining, for your generosity and time and spirit and service. We appreciate that very much. And so thank you. And I just want to pause to talk now so that you all, if you don't have it in your calendar, our next event is, see if I can quickly pull this up so you can see. June 22, it's what I was talking about earlier, in person. We'll be talking about the Management Mountain. Brandon McVall from LTI and Jim Smucker from Kime will be with us at Berkshire Country Club in Reading. We'll spend the morning there. We'll have a meal together. And then July 8, we'll be talking about the do's and don'ts of buy-sell agreements. We'll probably move to in person for that as well. We'll focus on the Advisor Mountain in September. And then we're going to have awesome conversations with women who have transitioned to the CEO role.